something like Zoran's campaign can happen and can even succeed. And what that should tell us is that if we can have the imagination and the courage to not play politics, but actually lead with our values and our politics, there is a universe where that can win, and it is here. We are in it.
Yes, there are Shakers of the RSS outside of India, and there have been since the 1940s, and became quite popular as a way of groups, communities sort of coming together, places to send kids to socialize with other children from a sort of similar background, but also be sort of culturally and ideologically inculcated in a particular kind of way of thinking.
And I think this also created the grounds for an alignment between the Hindu right and particularly the Zionist movement here in the U.S., where the rhetoric around weaponizing claims of anti-Semitism has been very closely linked to the rhetoric around weaponizing claims of Hinduphobia.
A couple of years ago, we saw a nonprofit organization in Texas, a Hindu nonprofit organization, literally raising money. We saw their flyer that was public, and the flyer said that money was being raised for the destruction of churches in India.
The Labour Party kind of passed a resolution supporting the right to self-determination of Kashmiri people. And this ignited absolute outrage. The Overseas Friends of the BJP actively campaigned. They expressed, explicitly that they were going to campaign in various marginal constituencies, which was quite unprecedented. A representative of an international, a foreign political party campaigning against another political party in the UK.
Friends, salam, namaste, zindabad. I'm Harsh Mander. I welcome you to one more episode of the series that Karwan-e-Mohabbat is doing with Scroll. It's called Daag Daag, Ye Daag Daag Ujala, in tribute to an iconic poem by Faiz Ahmed Faiz. In this, we are talking about the global impact of the ideology of Hindutva, how it operates, and its implications both for social relations and human rights within India and in the countries of origin where the Indian diaspora lives and works. We have a great panel here, and I welcome, on the one hand, Ed Anderson. He teaches history in Northumbria University in the UK. He's also a senior fellow at the SOAS. And importantly, he just wrote this book, Hindu Nationalism in the Indian Diaspora, Transnational Identities and the Politics of Multiculturalism. So, very warm welcome, Ed. And on the other hand, we have Sunita Vishwanath and Pranay Somayajula. These are two leading lights of an organization, a very important and significant and brave organization called Hindus for Human Rights. It's an organization based in the United States. It's devoted to promoting religious pluralism, both in India and South Asia and in the United States. The title Hindus for Human Rights also, I think, underlines their central premise that the Hindu faith, in fact, does not encourage or promote or prescribe hate against other religions. Quite the contrary. Am I right, Sunita, Pranay?
Absolutely. Yeah. And also because we have Ed, we also have branches in the United Kingdom and Australia.
Okay, great. And and so you're also concerned with promoting religious pluralism in these countries as well, where you are located. So friends, the RSS is celebrating its 100th year since its formation in India. It's gone from a difficult situation immediately after independence with the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi, where it was widely believed that Nathuram Godse was strongly influenced by the ideology of Hindutva. Whether he was a formal member of the RSS or not is a matter of discussion. But it was a time when the RSS went into the shadows, in a sense, of public life in India after Gandhiji's assassination. It was briefly banned. It very sort of conspicuously rejected the Indian Constitution. In fact, the Indian Tricolor itself, the RSS did not unfurl the Indian flag for almost 50 years in protest against the constitutional pledge of equal rights for people of every religion and faith and equal belonging to India. But the RSS has reached a point from being in the shadows. It came out of the shadows actually with Jayaprakash Narayan and the movement against the regime of Indira Gandhi. The RSS joined a larger formation, and it was and since then it hasn't looked back. The RSS has reached a position today when almost every leading constitutional position in this country is held by people who have spent considerable parts of their life within the RSS. It's the largest paramilitary organization of this kind in the world. But that's the story of the RSS in India. But there is a story of Hindutva organizations in different parts of the world, in Europe, in North America, in Australia, and elsewhere. Also in other countries which have significant populations of people who've immigrated from India, also in Nepal, which has a significant Hindu population. So today we would be discussing in this year, the 100th year of the RSS, what really is happening with Hindutva organizations committed to the Hindutva, formally or informally associated with the RSS in the diaspora. And I couldn't find a better set of people to discuss this. So let me start straight with, and I'll throw out questions, and any of you might, any of you who want to respond, please do. My first question is that a significant section of people of Hindu identity living in India reject Hindutva. It's completely wrong to believe that the RSS represents Hindus. It represents a certain stream of religious thought or political Hinduism, Hindu supremacism, which we call Hindutva, and a significant section of people of Hindu identity in India reject Hindutva. Is it correct to believe that this proportion, that a significant part of people of Hindu identity in the diaspora also reject Hindutva, or is there much greater support? We hear that Hindu places of worship in North America and Europe, Australia are hotbeds of RSS propaganda. They have significant support. How much of the Indian diaspora of Hindu identity actually support the ideology of the RSS. Maybe Sunita would be good for you and Pranay to come in on this.
I honestly don't believe that in the diaspora, the majority of people in the Hindu community support the hateful fascist ideology of the RSS. I don't believe that. And Pranay might have more statistics to share with us in a moment from the few surveys that have been done. But I've been going into the Hindu community, mostly in America, since before 2011. Just because this is before Modi became prime minister. Since then, because I've noticed in my own personal spaces, like family, when I go to temple, when I go to friends, Diwali, just Hindu spaces, that there even since before 2011 there was a marked difference in those spaces. There was an expression in a more explicit way of not just something that veers on Islamophobia, definitely hate speech towards Muslims, but also a defensiveness and a sense that some kind of fear or insecurity, those kinds of expressions I was beginning to notice. And I started asking the question, where are Hindus who don't feel this way, who are bothered the way I'm bothered by these trends? And so, what I have found is that when I go into Hindu spaces to bring up questions of representation, of rights, of why are we feeling insecure, those questions are met with sometimes. Sometimes I'm met with people who are bigoted and they discriminate, but most times I'm met with puzzlement. Like, why are you coming to this Diwali party and being such a downer?
Mm-hmm.
And then when you have a deeper conversation, what I find anyway is some of the Hindutva messages have reached, and there might be some feelings of mistrust of non-Hindu communities, but mostly there's a sense of who's looking out for us. Hindus have nobody. The Muslims have people standing out for them. The Christians have people standing up for them. Who's standing up for Hindus? Really, a sense of insecurity and a wounded pride. So that's what I find when I go into the Hindu spaces. And when I go into the more progressive spaces where people are addressing social justice issues, I find many Hindus there, people with Hindu names. They may not be leading with their Hindu identity, and they may not even embrace their Hindu identity. But clearly, people from the broad Hindu community, ranging from faith-based people to atheists and agnostics and religion skeptics, we are there. So a huge proportion of Hindu community members, whether they identify or not, are participating in social justice work. And if someone did a census, that they would count as Hindus. So all this to say that I really think that the majority of people in the Hindu diaspora are not hateful RSS supporters.
Pranay, you want to supplement that? She said, as with any of your surveys, I'm worried about how much the central propaganda of the RSS is that Hindus are a huge majority in India, but they are being discriminated in their own country, and they are under various kinds of threat, and the threat comes from Muslim and Christian Indian citizens. How much of that sense of cultivated fear and resentment do you find among Hindus in the diaspora?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Sunita, for those points. I mean, obviously, I entirely agree with your analysis. I would say that in my experience of doing this work with Hindus for Human Rights, what I've really found is that in the diaspora, especially here in the United States, which is where I'm based, the hearts and minds of our community are very much a contested battleground, right? They're not, and I think most people in our community are not won over to our side or to the Hindutva side. I think, people are um often people don't feel a very strong connection to Indian politics. And I think generally from, like Sunita said, the limited surveys that have been done of the Indian American community, there is a general sense of concern about declining religious freedom, collapsing democracy in India, those issues, human rights issues in India. But generally speaking, Hindutva is not something that's really at the top of mind, I think, for a lot of people in our community. I think that is precisely why we have seen the Hindu right go after our community so aggressively and trying to win them over by precisely what you just said, Harsh, constructing this sort of narrative of threat, and this is not unique to Hindutva. Every fascist movement, every far right nationalist movement, the only way it is able to win people over to its cause is by convincing them that they are under threat from some scapegoat, and that only this movement is capable of defending them against the threat, right? This is what Nazism did by convincing Germans that they were under threat from Jews. This is what Trump is doing by convincing Americans that they're under threat from immigrants. This is exactly what Hindutva does. And so, here in the US, that takes the form of particular narratives around so-called Hindu phobia and so on, which tries to convince Hindus that you are in fact being discriminated against, you are in fact under threat, and that this is tied to the same forces that are attacking Hindus back in the homeland, the subcontinent. But I think that it's very easy to lapse into sort of a pessimism and sort of give up on the community, right? Say that, oh, everyone has already bought into this BJP RSS ideology, but I don't think that's true. I don't think that that is borne out by the experience that, Sunita and I have when we actually go out and talk to people in our community. The community it's very much a battlefield and it's very much up for grabs. And I think that we are, this is why we do the work that we do, right? To engage in that contestation precisely to make sure that the other side is not able to monopolize our community in that way.
So Ed, coming to you, I mean, both your response to this question, but I also wanted to, your own book talks a lot about this. For that section of the diaspora, Indian Hindu identity, people in the diaspora, what is it that attracts them to the ideology of the RSS and Hindutva? So what proportion, but also what is it that draws them to this?
Thanks, Harsh. I'll maybe if I can come back to that question, but first just respond to your initial question, which was about the popularity. And I'll sort of come at it from a slightly different perspective from Sunita and Pranay, perhaps. And also, I should premise what I'm going to say by, emphasizing that my main area of sort of research has been on the UK, although I do, think more transnationally and globally about Hindu nationalism as well. And I'm very interested in what's happening in America. I mean, obviously, I do think that a lot of Indians in the diaspora are drawn towards Hindutva in one way or another. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't have written a book about it. And obviously, it has become an almost received wisdom. I mean, when you speak to people, particularly when you speak to people in India, there is this kind of received wisdom that everyone in the diaspora is very sympathetic towards the Hindu nationalist movement, towards Modi, the BJP, whatever aspects of it that might be. And I think that, there is something in that. I mean, there have been some very spectacular sort of moments which would sort of provide some level of evidence for that. We see the packing out of big stadiums, Madison Square Garden straight after the election in 2014, then Wembley Stadium. There's been various things in other parts of the world, Australia and Texas and all sorts. So these provide these very sort of striking images that the media grasps hold of and that are shared widely online. So on the one hand, perhaps that does suggest that there is a great deal of popularity. But on the other hand, I think that that can be somewhat misleading. First of all, just because you're turning out to a stadium to look at Narendra Modi, that doesn't necessarily mean that you sort of subscribe to Hindutva. Even support for the BJP and Modi doesn't necessarily imply support for the more ideological components or all the ideological components of Hindutva either. And another point to make is that there's obviously a kind of a sort of strategic desire to convey this idea that there is this broad support. I mean, Hindu nationalism, by its very nature, is a majoritarian ideology. It needs to present the nation as unified, as having this kind of monolithic, sort of homogenous almost community, the Hindu community. And so the idea that everybody feels the same way does have this quite affective power. But actually, there has been, a strong and long movement against this for a long, long time. Obviously, Sunita and Pranay represent one part of that has emerged and grown quite significantly in recent years. But there's been a very, very long historical tradition of progressive politics, leftism, secularism, liberal ideas amongst the Indian diaspora for a very long time. I mean, Hindu nationalism's existed for a long time in the diaspora, but left-wing politics amongst Indian groups has existed for much longer. I mean, for instance, in Britain, there was the Indian Workers' Association, which was established in the 1930s, a socialist group of Indians. So there have been these kind of traditions that are quite antithetical to Hindutva that have existed for a long time in the diaspora and certainly continue to exist. And there are some sort of figures as well that back up that idea of a kind of plurality of beliefs. I think in Britain in late 2023, early 2024, there was a survey conducted by, I believe, the Platform for Indian Democracy, which suggested actually that it's a minority of people that support the BJP and Modi in the diaspora. I mean, another important point to make before I pass over to someone else is also that we mustn't conflate, of course, the Indian diaspora with the Hindu diaspora as well. I mean, when we're talking about Britain, let's not lose sight of the fact that there are 250,000 Indian Muslims in Britain as well, who are, obviously not going to be inclined towards these sorts of ideologies. There's a very, very sort of diverse Indian diaspora. So the idea that they all kind of have one particular set of beliefs is of course not going to be the case.
Yeah, just holding on to that point a little longer. How have you found people of Dalith identity and self-conscious Dalit identity and assertion? How have they responded to in the diaspora? Have responded to Hindutva? Both Ed and any of you who want to respond.
I can answer. Well, in Hindus for Human Rights, we wouldn't be doing this work if we did not perceive a really painful prevalence of Hindutva tendencies, ideology in our community. That's why we're doing this. But doing this work, we find that there's actually quite a lot of hope, because we encounter many people, particularly young people, who are able to connect their Hindu identity with beautiful liberatory values. So if Pranay and I answered in a more hopeful way, it's because it's that hope that fuels what we are doing. But obviously, there's a very dark reason we're even on this journey. So Ed, I mean, obviously there's a real problem that we're all here to discuss. And Harsh, to your question about what the Dalit community thinks about Hindutva, but also how we work with them. In the diaspora, we work with a number of Dalit organizations and Ambedkarite organizations. I mean, granted, it's a real testament to them that they are willing to work with a group like us, because the origins of the dehumanization of their community since, hundreds, thousands of years perhaps, originates in this religion that I happen to be born into. So there's a real sense of skepticism around an anti-caste Hinduism that we assert, whether it can really exist, whether it has hope. But strategically, it makes sense for all of us who stand against caste and Hindutva to work together. We need each other. And there's a real sort of at least a strategic solidarity of convenience. And every day there's some fire to put out. So we work very well together. But if ever there were time and space to sit down and have deep conversations, I think that we need to, because I yearn for the day when we can sit together with our Dalit and Ambedkarite friends, brothers and sisters to, get into deeper conversations about what can we do to actually take a step closer to annihilation of caste. And Pranay is the leader of this, but within Hindus for Human Rights, we've just this year started a series somewhat like this one, Harsh, and we call them our liberation baitaks, and we bring people together to talk about, just have sort of slower paced conversations that get us closer to that question of what does an anti-caste Hinduism actually look like in our lives today, not as some, lofty ideal. And we had Anand Teltumde on one of our Baitaks recently. And Anand Teltumde, who is one of India's iconic Dalit rights scholars, human rights proponents, prisoner of conscience for many months. He's on our advisory board. So that tells you the fact that he's with us and he's rooting for us, that tells you that he believes in our mission. And he came onto our Baitak and he listed out 10 guardrails. Basically, yes, you must work towards an anti-caste Hinduism, but here are 10 from Anand, 10 prerequisites for an anti-caste Hinduism concretely existing today. And to me, they sort of they synthesize into this. You cannot talk about anti-caste Hinduism without first addressing the material realities of Dalits in the world living today. You cannot talk about the lofty ideal of annihilation of caste without addressing the fact that, for instance, 99% of the manual scavengers in India are Dalit. Yeah. So these are the conversations that we are having, and all of our work happens hand in hand with our Dalit and Ambedkarite partners.
Yeah, that's
and if Pranay, you want to add to this?
Yeah. Pranay, no, that's a precious conversation, but a difficult one, because simply a celebration of the true Hindu faith gets you badly entangled in the reality that caste discrimination has been central to the Hindu faith, as Baba Sahib Ambedkar often pointed out. So I think, yes, the fact that you're working together to fight hate and discrimination, both to people of other identities, but also to people within the Hindu identity who have suffered. I think that is really crucial.
And it's a reimagining of this this plurality of faith traditions that we, for ease, call Hinduism. It's a reimagining. It's a reform. It's it's a changing thing, and we often bring Hindu practitioners, panditas and pandits and swamis into the conversation to talk about how, in their service to the community, they are actually practicing a daily Hinduism that does not accept caste.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a difficult but very, very important kind of journey that you need to do, both within India and outside. Friends, I just may I I'm conscious of time, I wanted to leap into many questions, but one that I cannot hold back from is the political choices that people in the diaspora who are supporters of Hindutva, how are they making political choices within their countries? Do they opt for the right and the far right, or are they comfortable with the contradiction of supporting the far right in India and looking for centrist or center left kind of options within their own countries? Why I wanted to sort of deep into this question, worrying that we may not have time, is of course because at the time we speak, Zoran Mamdani has won this spectacular primary, and it's just just watching him on internet. He seems a really a man of charm, but much more than that, he's spoken about. He bravely said he rejects Modi and he sees him as a mass killer. He proudly embraces his own Muslim identity, and he also talks about welfare. As a sort of practicing left-leaning person with looking at public goods, transport and food and childcare and so on. So I found it extremely refreshing. I found his politics very close to my own. But then we heard about this very vicious campaign by sections of the Indian diaspora against him. And then this morning I read something that Donald Trump wrote, where he was saying Zoran Mamdani is 100% communist lunatic, and we've had radical lefties before with this, but he is terrible. He looks terrible. His voice is grating. He's not very smart, and so on and so forth. I mean, about Zoran's looks, I think there can be very little dispute, but even about the rest. But the fact that we saw so much of organized hate against this first person who credibly could become the first South Asian mayor of New York. What does this tell about the politics of the Indian diaspora, the Hindu identity Indian diaspora in countries like the US? And Ed, you could also come in, but Sunita, Pranay, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I can take this question. It's a really interesting question and quite a complex one. I should say that we're a nonprofit organization, Hindus for Human Rights, so we don't really like comment on individual elections or political candidates. But I do think the dynamics that you just described, Harsh, are reflective of a much broader political dynamic that we have observed over the last few years. Because I think the answer to this question of how does the Hindu right engage with politics here in the US, the answer has changed over time. What I mean by that is that even 5-10 years ago, I would say the dominant sort of political figure that Hindutva groups like the VHPA, Hindu American Foundation, and so on were trying to court, you could describe them as, the Modi Democrat, right? Is in the Democratic Party is a center-left liberal on LGBT rights, abortion rights, climate change, these sort of social issues that are central to the Democratic Party, might be pro-union and so on. But then also will take lots of money from Hindutva donors and will be very pro-Modi, will repeat pro-BJP talking points, defend the religious freedom records of the BJP government. Someone like Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy in Illinois or Sri Thanedar in Michigan are good examples of that in the U.S. Congress. That type of figure absolutely does still exist, especially in more liberal democratic states like California or New Jersey, where there are very large Indian populations. The Hindu right has very much tried to sort of cultivate and court those sorts of figures. But as the United States political discourse in general across all communities has shifted more and more towards the far right in recent years, as you've had the rise of Trump and the MAGA movement, this extremely right-wing nationalist politics here, which is, of course, happening around the world, we've seen the Hindu right increasingly align itself with those forces, increasingly start using the language, the rhetoric, the sort of talking points and dog whistles of what the broader American far right, including the white supremacist far right, uses. You hear where you might hear MAGA far right candidates talking about critical race theory. All of a sudden, you hear the Hindu American Foundation talking about critical caste theory, right? You hear them going after their political opponents as not just as Hindu-phobic, but also saying that they're woke, they're Marxists, they're radical leftists. These are the sort of language that you hear from Trump. I mean, you hear it in the tweet you just read from Trump about Zoran Mamdani, right? That's not necessarily the kind of rhetoric we would have seen even 5 years ago, 10 years ago from the leaders of the Hindu American Foundation, for example. But now they feel emboldened to really sort of take the mask off and I think embrace that far right rhetoric, which of course is where I think their sympathies in reality have aligned all along. It's just that now it's politically expedient for them to align themselves with that more openly. I wrote an article for Jacobin magazine about precisely this phenomenon, earlier this year. It was quite shocking that at after Trump's inauguration in January, there was a Hindus and Latinos for Trump inaugural ball celebrating it here in DC, where Rajiv Pandit, who is a board member of the Hindu American Foundation, was at not only in attendance at this Trump inaugural ball, but was praising the Trump administration and was being interviewed by a man named Krishna Guripati, who was 4 years ago at the Capitol Hill insurrection on January 6th, waving the Indian flag, and he's a member of the VHPA. But the fact that, you go from the Hindu American Foundation 5 years ago talking about climate change, LGBT rights, saying that we work bipartisanly and in fact are quite liberal on many issues, to now their board members are being interviewed by January 6th insurrectionists at a Trump inaugural ball, I think says something about the kinds of shifts that we are seeing in the Hindu right and their political choices that they make here in the diaspora. The only other thing I'll add before I pause and would love to hear Sini and Ed's reflections on this as well is that I think that one of the ways that the movement has continued to operate both in the past and in the present is by really weaponizing the language of multiculturalism and minority rights, claiming that they speak for all Hindus, that they represent the rights and the interests of Hindus, which of course makes them more palatable to well-meaning liberals who want to make sure they're not racist, who want to make sure they're not being, Islamophobic or Hindu-phobic, right? They want to take what communities are saying at face value. This has absolutely been exploited by the Hindu right, and I think this also created rather the grounds for an alignment between the Hindu right and particularly the Zionist movement here in the US, where the rhetoric around weaponizing claims of anti-Semitism has been very closely linked to the rhetoric around weaponizing claims of Hindu phobia. In fact, you now hear the leaders of right-wing Hindu groups like the VHPA and HAF and so on saying that Hindu phobia and anti-Semitism are fundamentally interlinked and intertwined. It's the same forces that fuel both of these hatreds. And that's a really clear example of this sort of weaponized politics of diversity and multiculturalism that we see playing out in very damaging ways. So I'll pause there and would love to hear reflections from my colleagues on that.
Yeah, and what would you say about the UK? I mean, has the movement, he's saying that there were probably far right sympathies, but they've come to the fore, they've got legitimized, and they're expressed without apology. Would you say that for the UK as well?
Yes, in some ways, and no in others, but certainly a lot of the sort of dynamics that we've just been hearing about do have parallels in the UK. I mean, this kind of question of voting, isn't always as straightforward as you might imagine, and as has been sort of already said, the idea that support for the Hindu right on one part of the planet would therefore translate into support for right-wing parties and another doesn't always work out. And it's a complicated thing. I mean, there's a historical reason for that partly. I mean, the Indian diaspora, like most other migrant communities in the West, have tended to support centre or centre-left parties, the Democrats, the Labour Party, partly on the basis that, these are parties which have been more sympathetic to immigration and more proactive in sort of outlawing racism and so on. This is a historical trend, and in fact, certainly in Britain at the moment, there's very little between the so-called Labour Party and the Conservative Party when it comes to their kind of desire to be as anti-immigration as possible.
Likewise, likewise between Kamala Harris and Trump, you could really hear. I mean, she was more polite, but there wasn't a fundamental difference in how
I think that's true. There has been a sort of pandering to that rhetoric on both sides of the pond. Although I mean, there are various differences. Like there are various significant differences. I mean, the Democrats have never really been a left-wing party, whereas Labour ostensibly are a socialist party by constitution. But anyway, that's sort of slightly tangential. What we have seen certainly, though, is a drift away amongst Indian and Hindu voters away from Labour and towards the Conservative parties. And I guess, part of that is because the Conservatives have made a very explicit effort to try and embrace Indian and Hindu voters. And, we can see one manifestation of that at the very, very top. Of course, Britain's first non-white Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is a reflection of that. We also had subsequent Home Ministers, Priti Patel and Suella Braverman, both of whom, in fact, all three of these people are Hindu East African Asians. They have that heritage at least, and all three of them have been, very much at the forefront of anti-immigrant rhetoric as well. So there has been a kind of shift towards the Conservative Party amongst Indian voters, and in a way, there's a kind of, it makes sense. It's not entirely surprising. I mean, the Conservative Party frame themselves as the party for entrepreneurs, of small business owners. They are a party of social conservatism as well. They are not, professing the kind of liberal attitudes of the Labour Party in quite the same way. And one can see why that might align with a kind of social conservatism of the Indian diaspora as well. But there are also more kind of specific political reasons why this has happened. And one of them was in that 2015, post-2015 period when the Labour Party were led by Jeremy Corbyn, and they, moved to the left on various issues, and they adopted some quite strong positions on human rights. And Corbyn very quickly became this sort of real figure of hate for the Hindu right. In fact, he had been for a while. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn had spoken out after the Gujarat violence of 2002. He's been critical of Modi. He's also been a strong ally to Dalit movements, Dalit groups that have sought to legislate against caste discrimination, which is something that Hindu nationalist groups have tried to resist, and in Britain so far have successfully resisted. And then most controversially of all, under Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party kind of passed a resolution supporting the right to self-determination of Kashmiri people. And Corbyn himself spoke about human rights abuses in Kashmir. And this ignited absolute outrage and a real concerted effort by political activists, both in India and in Britain, to try and sort of paint the Labour Party as anti-Indian, anti-Hindu. Even terms like jihadi sympathizers were being thrown around. And actually, in the end, the Overseas Friends of the BJP actively campaigned. They expressed, explicitly that they were going to campaign in various marginal constituencies, which was quite unprecedented. A representative of an international, a foreign political party campaigning against another political party in the UK. Whether or not that had an influence is to be seen. Although what has happened since then is that Keir Starmer, the current Labour leader, has very clearly tried to undo a lot of that, work of Corbyn, well, all the work of Corbyn, really. But when it comes to Indian diaspora issues and Hindu diaspora issues, he's spoken about resetting relations and has taken a very different position. But just sorry, I've been talking a long time, but I just want to come on to one more point, which relates to, the politics of the far right. We've spoken about Trump and the Conservative Party and so on, but there's another dimension of that, which is this kind of tie-up between Hindu nationalists and the far right, which might on the surface seem sort of unusual, to put it mildly, in that the far right are characterized by being anti-immigrant and racist. But there are parallels. There are sort of shared ideas of Islamophobia. There's this sort of civilizational discourse, the idea of being a kind of majority under siege, and also being prone to sort of ideas of the replacement theory, for instance. And what we've seen is quite strategic alliances on occasion. I mean, one kind of very dramatic moment where that happened was in I think 2016, when a group called the National Council for Hindu Temples in the UK actually invited the far right fascistic former leader of the EDL, the English Defence League, someone called Tommy Robinson, to sort of speak at an event, and in the end that had to be cancelled. But that shows the kind of level of, I think subsequently he's been invited on Op India and various other sort of, so there are kind of interesting things going on there. That's just one example. And then one other example, and I'll end here, is the connection between Hindutva and Zionism, another form of far right politics, and this has been a very sort of fertile ground for kind of collaboration and cooperation over the last few years in particular. And there's a very important study on this by the writer Azad Essa.
Yeah, that's playing out a lot within India itself. I mean, this complete shift from being the most ardent supporters of the Palestinian people to being in support of genocidal violence against the people in Gaza by large sections of the Hindutva groups in India itself. Sunita, we have a lot of more ground to cover, but I wanted to ask you, just related to this, what about the non-Hindu diaspora?
Well, before I think about that, as a New Yorker,
Yes.
I think I have to express here the complete euphoria that we are feeling about this election that just happened. And so Zoran Mamdani is the son of Indian people of Indian heritage, and he's Muslim. And the fact that somebody who has been so outspoken, and by the way, I'm speaking as myself, not as Hindus for Human Rights, because Hindus for Human Rights is a 501c3 organization that cannot participate in electioneering. But I personally have been involved in supporting Zoran's campaign, fundraising, canvassing, you name it. Very, very excited about this candidate. When in the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, when the foundation stone was laid, the Hindutva Brigade live streamed that in Times Square in New York City. And many of us participated in a protest in Times Square, and Zoran Mamdani was there with us. And I just was seeing a video from 2023 in City Winery in New York City, where there was an event about human rights in India, and Zoran was reading out a letter written by Umar Khalid in prison. So this is a man who has not shied away from openly talking about human rights and religious freedom in India. He is fiercely pro-Palestine. He's been arrested for participating in pro-Palestine rallies. And New York City is the city second only to Tel Aviv in the number of Jewish residents of the city. And he has won the Democratic primary. And what this should tell us is that, yes, there is a tendency toward a sharp increase in members of each of our communities trending far right. That is happening in the Indian community in America and most minority communities in America. There was a sharp increase in votes towards Trump in the last national election. So while that is happening, though, something like Zoran's campaign can happen and can even succeed. And what that should tell us is that if we can have the imagination and the courage to not play politics, but actually lead with our values and our politics, there is a universe that where that can win, and it is here. We are in it. And so every time we try and bring people to the platform to speak up about what is in their heart, there is so much fear. But I hope that this election in my city can inspire us to take the risk, for our future. And
that's
that's New
wonderful.
York City today.
No, that's wonderful. And while you were speaking, I was wishing that the Indian National Congress in India should show the same kind of moral courage to speak out. They've refused over and over again to speak out against the persecution of Muslims, against lynching, against the Gujarat massacre, against the arrest of people like Umar Khalid. And Mamdani's really shown the way, I think, and in the UK, I mean, where the centre-left parties are increasingly trying to imitate the right and don't have the moral courage to stand for the values of pluralism, secularism, socialism. I think it is very inspiring. Just looking at the clock, Ed, looking at your research, I was curious about if we can have a little time to talk about how organizations like the RSS, when they operate in the diaspora, how do they adapt? I recall that Mr. Modi spent a lot of his life as a pracharak of the RSS in the diaspora in various countries. But do we have shakhas? Do we have gatherings of the kind that we see in India, or have they have they taken different forms?
It's an interesting question, and that's one of the main focuses of the book is kind of exploring that one. The answer is that yes, there are shakas of the RSS outside of India, and there have been since the 1940s. Interestingly, actually, the first shakas took place not in Britain, not in the US, or anywhere like that, but actually in East Africa. There was a substantial Asian population in East Africa from the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And this was a community that was tight-knit, that was very much connected with India. And it was in that context in the 1940s that the first RSS shakas emerged and became quite popular as a way of groups, communities sort of coming together, places to send kids to socialize with other children from a sort of similar background, but also be sort of culturally and ideologically inculcated in a particular kind of way of thinking. And it then when a lot of these countries became independent and started to kind of push out the Asian population in the 1960s and early 70s, at that point, those sorts of organizations then moved over to Britain and elsewhere. So yes, there's a kind of range of organizations now of the Sangh Parivar. The VHP has overseas branches. There's obviously overseas Friends of the BJP branches outside India. So some of these Sangh Parivar groups have direct equivalents in various parts of the world, but there are some which have adapted quite substantially because the context is fundamentally different. So for example, yes, there are student groups that are affiliated with Hindutva and that have close connections with other groups of the Sangh Parivar, but they don't operate in a way which is very comparable to the ABVP, for example. And what we've also seen in America, in the diaspora, including America, and some examples of this have just been given by Sunita and Pranay, are the emergence of new sorts of organizations that are not necessarily directly connected to the Sangh or that hide Sangh links, or maybe, are completely different, that frame themselves as sort of broad, mainstream, representative organizations. They operate very much in that kind of milieu, that environment of multiculturalism. They use the spaces and the language of multiculturalism and community representation. So they don't look really like the kind of Hindutva organizations that you'd be familiar with in India. But actually, underneath all of that, there often is a very strong strain of Hindutva ideology, which is very strategically sort of developed and espoused and performs a very powerful role in terms of advocacy, in terms of presenting ostensibly the views of the Indian community or the Hindu community, and which is something that I've tried to understand through this idea of neo-Hindutva, and that's certainly become a strong strain of Hindu nationalism in recent years. And I think in many ways it's more influential than perhaps the kind of shakas of the Sangh, which yes, they do operate in many countries of the world, but the kind of uptake on them is a relatively small proportion of the Hindu community.
But thank you for that. I just want to jump in really quickly to add something to what you said, which is that I think a very clear example of this type of sort of new generation of Hindutva organization in the US that really I think exemplifies this perfectly is the Hindu American Foundation, which I've alluded to in some of my previous responses to your questions, Harsh. And HFHR is one of the core members of a coalition called the Severa United Against Supremacy Coalition, which over the last year and a half has put out a series of reports on the Hindutva movement here in the US. Our most recent report came out last October. Really, it's called Halfway to Supremacy. It really goes into the history and the politics of the Hindu American Foundation. And, as we really show in that report, HAF was founded in the early 2000s by a group of young second generation. So they were born in the US, and this sort of sets them apart from other Hindutva groups like the VHPA, which were founded by Indian immigrants, whereas the founders of the Hindu American Foundation were all born and raised in Indian families, but here in the US, and were raised and really they got their start politically in the VHPA and its affiliated organizations like the Hindu Students Council. But early emails from VHPA listservs, for example, show that they saw the need for a new organization that would be focused on the diaspora, that wouldn't be as tied to the baggage of Indian politics, and that would be seen as independent, seen as more polished, younger, sort of more slick in its presentation to make it more palatable to not just American civil society and liberal civil society, but also to policymakers, to people in Congress, people in the White House and the State Department, and so on. And that is precisely what they did by founding the Hindu American Foundation with money. A lot of their funders, the big donors writing the big checks to them, are the same people who are funding the HSS Shakas, the VHPA here in the U.S. But the way they present themselves is much more polished. It looks much more like any of the organizations that represent any minority community and are seen as sort of the legitimate civil society representatives of those groups, those interest groups here in the U.S. That's a very intentional strategy that I think really exemplifies the dynamic that Ed was talking about. It's one that's been directly copied in particular from the way that Zionist groups like the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee have organized themselves. In fact, HAF's founders directly sought inspiration from those groups in setting up their organization. But I just wanted to give that as an illustrative example of what Ed was so correctly talking about.
Yeah,
Thanks. If I can just come in quickly there, just to sort of observe something and sort of bring a theme that we mentioned earlier back in. There's an interesting thing going on because Pranay is absolutely right. These are groups which are very well versed in the kind of strategy and rhetoric of multiculturalism, and they can be very successful in terms of being kind of the go-to group when, say, the government is seeking the voice of the Hindu community. The kind of air quotes are to suggest that actually there isn't a single voice of the Hindu community and that this is not a sort of monolithic entity that might have a single perspective on anything. What's interesting is that, yes, they work in that kind of context of multiculturalism, and actually recently they are also quite engaged in using the kind of language of decoloniality, a kind of almost a leftist rhetoric of kind of anti-colonial or anti-imperialist thinking. And certainly when ideas of Hindu phobia are brought up, that's brought in. Another one is caste. Caste is often framed by these groups, or the kind of evils of caste is framed as a sort of colonial invention, for example. So they kind of operate in that language. And what's interesting, I think, is thinking like the fact that these groups are doing that on the one hand, but on the other hand, they're also adopting the kind of complete other sort of rhetoric, the kind of rhetoric of wokeism and sort of liberalism gone mad, and pseudo secularism, and they also use that sort of language on the other hand, and there's a funny tension going on there.
Just running out of time, I wanted to talk a little bit about funding. Sunita, maybe you would like to pick this up, but after 2002, progressive sections of the Indian diaspora excavated evidence of massive funding of the RSS and the BJP from overseas. And is this still the case? And if so, on what scale? And does the law in countries like the US and the UK, what do they say about this kind of support for ultimately, the actions of the far right, which ultimately result in real violence?
The question on the funding, I think, Pranay, you've been so steeped in the numbers that I think you would be better placed to answer.
Sure, yeah. The short answer to your question, Harsh, is yes. So there was a really great report that came out, I believe, in 2022, that looked at the funding flows of various Hindutva groups here in the US, HSS, VHPA, sort of the big, I think, the 8 or 9 of the largest organizations, and looked at the money that they are sending overseas to India through charitable networks in the sort of name of humanitarian aid and charitable donations and philanthropy. It was estimated, I think, somewhere in the realm of about $150 million between 2001 to 2019 were spent on their programming by these organizations, the vast majority of which was going to charities in India. But these charities in India are overwhelmingly linked to the RSS and the Sangh Parivar. These are organizations that on the ground in India have been setting up schools where they're teaching Hindutva ideology, that during state level election campaigns are even going and campaigning for the BJP. So there is a lot of this
Ekal
funding, yes?
Vidyalaya kind of organizations, I think, yes?
Yes, Ekal Vidyalaya is probably the most prominent example, but there's so many, so many smaller organizations that aren't as well known. But Ekal Vidyalaya is a great example of it. And I think that so it's, hundreds of millions of dollars really that is going to this work. And there isn't a whole lot, frankly, of legal oversight over this. Charitable philanthropy and charitable networks are pretty opaque in many ways, and there's not a lot of oversight. And you have to be transparent about it. You have to register as a foreign agent. I think that is a conversation absolutely worth having.
So,
And
yeah.
Harsh, we saw a couple of years ago, we saw a nonprofit organization in Texas, a Hindu nonprofit organization, literally raising money. We saw their flyer that was public, and the flyer said that money was being raised for the destruction of churches in India. So there's all this grassroots money that's being raised to send for nefarious purposes in India. And going back to Zoran Mamdani, last year he introduced, as a state assemblyman, he introduced a bill called Not on Our Dime. And I went to Albany to help support that bill as a New Yorker. And the bill was to make illegal, to ban nonprofit organizations in New York, charities, to raise money and get the tax exemption, and then for that money to support the settlers who are illegally settling Palestinian land. And so that was a bill that he introduced. And so as we go forward, I think, those of us who are fighting Hindutva in the diaspora can think of such mechanisms to expose and to fight this raising of money for violation of human rights in India.
So, friends, just wanted one set of last comments from your side. Looking to the future, humankind is clearly, at a very difficult moment where more and more people around the world are choosing leaders who are teaching us to hate. And, one of the most troubling things about Trump's election was the significant numbers of people of Black, Latino, and Asian background who supported Trump's hateful agenda against minorities. So where do you see the future of the diaspora and it's the possibilities and the probabilities of its contribution to progressive politics. So let's see Pranay, Edward, and then finally Sunita on this. Pranay.
I mean, Harsh, I wish I had a crystal ball and I could tell you where I see the future heading. Unfortunately, I think it can go one of two ways, right? And I think that as people who are engaged in political struggle, our responsibility and our work is to try and swing the pendulum in one direction, not the other. The two options are either we can have a future where our communities lapse into division and hate and the far right wins. I mean, that is a real possibility and that we have to face up against. But there is another future in which our communities, not just Hindus, but also Muslims and Sikhs and any community, particularly any minority community here in the US, recognizes that, in fact, the forces that threaten any one of our individual communities, the forces that are making Hindus as a religious minority feel increasingly othered and unsafe in this country, are in fact the same forces that are making Muslims feel increasingly unsafe and othered in this country, and Sikhs and so on, and that those are the forces of white supremacy, the forces of white Christian nationalism that are on the rise. And if we take that to be true, then there's only one logical conclusion to be drawn from it, which is that the only way to fight that is to in fact stand together, to build bonds of solidarity between our communities, to not allow the politics of division. I always think about, I was born in 2000, and so I've only ever grown up in a post 9/11 world, for all intents and purposes. And I think in the aftermath of 9/11, it didn't matter that, that not all brown people in the US are Muslim or Arab. We were all racialized as that, right? We all experienced the brunt of surveillance, of targeting, of persecution and bigotry in the aftermath of 9/11. And what kept our communities safe was not Hindus saying, "Oh no, we're Hindu, we're not Muslim." It wasn't Sikhs saying, "Oh no, just because we have turbans, we're not Muslim." It was all of our communities, in fact, standing together, right? That recognizing that all of us are being targeted by this, and that it is by keeping each other safe that we are actually going to overcome this. I think that lesson absolutely applies in the moment we find ourselves in now, and it's our responsibility as activists and organizers to build towards that.
Edward.
Well, I have a particular get out clause from having to sort of give predictions because I'm a historian, so I look completely in the other direction. But what I would say is, I think there is cause for optimism. We see the emergence of some really dynamic young leaders from, all sorts of backgrounds that are, at the forefront of kind of new forms of politics of solidarity and progressiveness and peace and resisting hatred and bigotry. So I think that there's certainly cause to be optimistic on that front. And certainly if we look at a very dynamic range of different organizations as well, grassroots organizations, clearly, there is a kind of different way of thinking about the world that is gaining lots of traction. And I'll just give one sort of example, from where I live in Newcastle, in the northeast of England. Last year, there were some devastating, awful, far-right racist riots. They weren't really riots. They were called riots, but as is often the case, they were attacks on minorities. And these took place across the country. In Newcastle in the northeast, a very, very diverse range of people came together to resist this. There was large protests on the streets, and we said, no, this isn't going to happen. These fascists, these white nationalists are not going to divide us. And what I saw there was groups of people from all different backgrounds, including people from across South Asia, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Hindus. And one amazing thing that happened is a group of young people from South Asia or South Asian origin, from many different backgrounds. They went around all these different places of worship, which were potentially going to be targeted by the far right. They went to the Gurudwara, to the masjid, to the mandir. And they all went around these and they all went hand in hand and said, you will not be attacking these places. We're going to stand up and we're going to stand together. And I think that was a really powerful symbol of young people, from across different backgrounds, across different communities wanting to stand together.
That's beautifully hopeful, Ed. And Sunita, do you see the same hope?
Yes, yes. for me, the deepest teaching from this religion I happen to be born into is this teaching of dharma. And to me, that means that every day I wake up and I figure out what I'm supposed to do, and I just do it. And if only we could all just wake up and make each day count towards this vision of oneness and solidarity that Ed and Pranay have just painted for us, I think we would be in such a better place. And speaking specifically to my community, the Hindu community, we have this at the moment at a zenith ideology of Hindu right-wing forces that are speaking for all of us and wreaking havoc and just brutality in our names. And we only need to look at our Jewish brothers and sisters to have a role model for what we could be doing. When in New York City for Zoran Mamdani's campaign, there were so many Jewish New Yorkers who were canvassing and protesting and celebrating and raising money for the possibility of the first Muslim New York mayor who was pro-Palestinian. If we can take inspiration from that and not engage in this conversation about, oh, I'm a Hindu, but I'm not really a Hindu, and I don't believe, if we can just put that aside, that's very navel-gazy. We can have those conversations. What is Hinduism? That's fine. But right now, the house is on fire. Put aside our egotistical conversation, just come together. I tried to build a Hindus for Zoran little group to fight off not just Harsh, not just Hindutva folks in the States, also in India, who were fighting Zoran's campaign. It was so hard to build a small little group of Hindus for Zoran. If only we could just put aside our sort of feelings about Hinduism to just come together to stand with the Muslims, the Sikhs, the Christians, the Dalits, whose lives are in the crosshairs of Hindutva ideology, we would very rapidly come closer to this beautiful vision that Pranay and Ed have painted. It is us. It's the Hindu community that needs to step up right now. And if there are, I'm sure there are many Hindus listening to this webinar. Please do whatever you can, and whenever you can, speak as a Hindu. Nothing is lost. A lot is to be gained.
Thank you for a lovely conversation. I really wish we had more time, and there's so much more to speak about and understand. But these words of hope at the end are very precious. I recall, during his last months of his life, when Mahatma Gandhi was so troubled by the violence of partition, which took 1 million lives, people told him, Gandhiji, you've become very pro-Muslim. And he said, yes, in India I will be pro-Muslim, and next I'll go to Pakistan, and there I'll be pro-Hindu. And I think that's a lesson to recall, that our identity as Hindu or Muslim or Sikh or non-believer or Christian is secondary to our identity as human beings who stand for humanity and in opposition to hate and discrimination. I think the fact that you're seeing young people, Ed also spoke about them, this business of coming together, holding hands around every place of worship and saying, we will not allow violence. I think that's where the hope lies. And I hope that young people in the diaspora will show us the way. So thank you, all of you, and good wishes. Salam, Zindabad.
ये दाग दाग उजाला, ये शब कसीदा सहर, वो इंतजार था जिसका, ये वो सहर तो नहीं।